Well, good evening and welcome to the first, and we hope a large number of programs focusing on the Vietnam War. We were the recipient, the library was a recipient of a grant from PBS, the American Library Association, and WETA of Washington, D.C., along with lots of program sponsors to receive the complete set of Ken Burns' Vietnam series on DVD, which we will start showing in the beginning of the new year on a regular basis. We have to set up a schedule for that. But we're doing some programming ahead of time related to the war. So we're happy to have you here. I'm just going to put a little quick plug in for tomorrow, something totally different than the war. Over the noon hour tomorrow, we have someone from the Cass Gilbert Society, and Cass Gilbert designed the furnishings for the state capitol. And apparently over the years, several of these pieces disappeared. So they are on the hunt, and so we have a little mystery story tomorrow. A representative from the society is going to tell us about how they are searching for these pieces. So we hope you can come over the noon hour tomorrow for that. Something a little calmer than war. Anyway, so we do have Patrick Moore here from Pioneer Public Television, and if you have questions about the series and when it's going to be rebroadcast and how you can access it on public television, please talk to Patrick afterwards. So I want to welcome Professor Jeff Kolnick from the History Department at Southwest State to talk about the beginnings of the war.
Well, it's good to be back in the library and an honor to be asked to talk about this and to do it in the context of the new documentary by Ken Burns, which is really a great piece of work. And if you haven't seen all of it, I encourage you to watch it. And we're going to see just a snippet of it tonight, maybe about 10 minutes of it, in the interest of getting out before the 9:30 scheduled closing. I guess I'll start by saying that I made it all the way through my graduate education without having really to confront the American involvement in Vietnam, and not until I taught my first class did I actually have to really look at it in any kind of serious way. When I did that, I discovered a kind of an intellectual project that has stayed with me for many years since then. I'm too young really to have been, much too young to have been drafted. I graduated from high school in 1977, and my parents didn't let me watch the war on TV like other children my age. And I was really shielded from it because of the ages of the kids in the neighborhood that I grew up in. All of us were around the same age, moving into a suburban development all around the same time. So even though I was alive and kind of conscious during the war, my knowledge of it personally was pretty limited. In 1995, I was part of a group of people that took students and some faculty to Vietnam as part of SMSU's Global Studies program. And it was the 20th anniversary of the end of the war in 1995. And you could feel that Vietnam was a new nation when we went there. We flew into Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, and we took a train up around the middle to the city of Hue along the coast. I guess there is a pointer. Yeah. Huh? I don't really use these babies too much. So Ho Chi Minh City is there. We spent about 4 days there, and then we took a train from Ho Chi Minh City to the city of Hue, which is the ancient capital where a very intense battle occurred during the Tet Offensive. And from there, we took a train to Hanoi, where we spent 3 days in Hanoi, and then we flew out. And that was a truly extraordinary experience in many ways for me. And I want to share with you some slides that tell you what I learned on that trip that's different from the book learning that I did and that I'll share with you tonight. First, I want to share this with you. This is kind of an interesting slide. You can look it up, but you can't really see it. This is called the World Championships, and Spy Magazine put it out at the end of the 1980s. And they have here at the end, I did the wrong one there. We have here at the end what they thought was the World Championship in the 80s was Vietnam versus Afghanistan, you know. because the Vietnamese had defeated the United States and the Afghanis had defeated the Soviet Union. So you can look at these brackets, and of course, I don't want to offend anybody, but Belgium loses in the first round, as you might imagine. But you can look at the brackets, and they run all of these wars that had occurred over the years, and then in the World Championship, it's Vietnam versus Afghanistan, and of course, the United States is today in Afghanistan, And if you kind of think about that, in '89, this was some people trying to chart out what the World Championships would be, and who would have thought that Vietnam, a country fraction of the size of the United States, at a level of development not even in the same league as the United States, could have kept us in a conflict for as many years as it did. Certainly none of the people that got us into the war could have imagined that. The last place we went to on our trip, and I'll start with that slide because I think it's very important, was a very large convention center. The most modern facility, or one of the two really modern facilities that we saw when we were in Vietnam. And it was a very large kind of open space where Vietnam was kind of projecting to the world what it could sell. So it was simply a plea for foreign investment, quite crudely, in 1995. And there was a banner, and I'm not exaggerating, the size of this building, which would be like the rec hall at SMSU, big building. And it said, "Vietnam is a country, not a war," in English. And that's really, to me, was an important lesson because I had never thought of Vietnam really as a country. I wasn't raised to think of Vietnam as a country. I was raised to think of Vietnam as a war, a place where a war happened, but certainly not a nation, and nothing really prepared me for that. And I think the lack of knowledge that many Americans had of Vietnam at the time that we became involved, from the 1940s through the 1970s, and even today, causes us to maybe make similar mistakes. That, in other words, we go to places and then those become wars. They're not nations that have histories of their own. And if we had understood Vietnam's history more, we might have not made the same choices. When we traveled to Hanoi, they took us on a tour. And Hanoi is a capital. And like so many capital cities, it has museums and it has huge public spaces. And the first place they took us in Hanoi was the Museum of History, the Vietnamese Museum of History. And when you walk into that museum, it becomes quite clear that the Vietnamese are telling a story. Imagine, if you will, why we send our children to museums. To tell stories about ourselves so that we come to understand who we are as a people. Right? And so at the Vietnamese Museum of History, you see that they have, fine pottery and an ancient culture, and they're basically saying we're an old place. We've been here forever. There's no people that preceded us on this land. Right? So when you go to the Museum of History, they have ancient Buddhas and ancient pottery and all kinds of things that are saying we've always been here. This is our home. A very, very powerful and a beautiful museum. The second place they took us is called the Temple of Literature. And these turtles on the right, there are many turtles, colonnades, two big, long colonnades of turtles. And on the back of the turtles, you can see little tablets. And on the tablets is written the wisdom of the ages, basically. All of the wisdom of Vietnamese culture and religion is carved into those tablets. And they took us there, and we walked the colonnades, and we couldn't read them, but we imagined that this was a place of learning that goes way back. And what they were telling us there, or telling the children, the busloads of Vietnamese children, is we are an ancient people, we have a tradition and history, we go way back, and it's written on the backs of these turtles. So if you want to become a scholar, you come to the Temple of Literature and you study these things over and over again, and there's the wisdom of the ages. Then they took us to the Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum, and there's the mausoleum there. Ho was in Moscow getting touched up, so he wasn't there for us to kind of look at. But there was this huge expanse of grass, and it was being cut by hand with Vietnamese people with a sickle, not a push mower. But they were cutting. You can tell that's a job for life, cutting the grass with a sickle in the huge expanse of space. But when you look at that expanse, you can say, like any country, this is a powerful nation. The state commands great space. The space looks good. We're a powerful people. And then this is Ho Chi Minh's home, and in comparison to many homes in Vietnam, it's not particularly humble, but it's not a lavish home by any means. And you go there and you look at his home where he was writing poetry, where his glasses are, where his pen was, where his writing table was. Surprisingly, in 1995, adjacent to the Ho Chi Minh home was the Ho Chi Minh gift shop, where there was a Pepsi Cola vending machine, which struck me as kind of like victory in a way, I suppose. So, and from there, they took us to the War Museum in Hanoi. And we'll see some video of this when we watched a little bit of the Ken Burns documentary. Has anybody traveled to Hanoi? Yeah. Did you do the same kind of tour? Okay. Were a prisoner of war in Hanoi? No. Okay. Yeah. So, and if I'm saying anything that you think is in,
I won't. I lived there for 15 years. I'm not going to interfere.
So, but later I'd like to hear if I'm. Yeah. Okay. This was an extraordinary experience for an American to go to the War Museum in Hanoi, as you might imagine. When you walk into the museum, you go to a building. It's really in three large buildings. The first building was a building dedicated to the liberation of the people of Vietnam from China. China occupied Vietnam for 1,000 years, nearly 1,000 years. And the history of that occupation and the expulsion of the Chinese is the first exhibit. And you learn in that exhibit there are women, the Trung sisters, who were involved in a rebellion against the Chinese, which they successfully repulsed the Chinese from the nation for a period of 2 years till the Chinese came back. And the Vietnamese to this day teach their children stories and nursery rhymes and songs about the Trung sisters, who are national heroes. And again, at the time that the decision was made for the U.S. to engage the Vietnamese in the conflict in the 1950s, to my knowledge, there was not one person in the State Department that spoke Vietnamese. So the capacity to know that story, in other words, if you're going to pick on a country, you don't pick on a country with culture heroes whose primary idea is to repel invaders, right? That successfully pushed out a 1,000-year occupation. Kind of like the Spanish did with the Muslim. That would be the easiest kind of parallel, 900-year occupation of Islam in Spain, and they pushed them out. And so I'm just curious, who would be the culture hero in Western civilization who's most prominent in terms of the expulsion of the Moors from Spain? Who? El Cid? I was thinking of another one. Ferdinand and Isabella, or Charlemagne. Charlemagne's another one. I guess that's not the expulsion, you're right. Charlemagne we know because he stopped the Moors at the Pyrenees. Is that what he did? I think that's what he did.
I think his father or grandfather, Charles Martel, did. Charles the Hammer.
Charles the Hammer stopped them at the Pyrenees.
Charles Martel.
Oh,
And his son or grandson was Charlemagne.
oh, is that right? So I got that wrong. Huh. Well, I think it
Martels where I grew up.
was one of the Martels. Are you? But we know this name Charlemagne ultimately, if we know it at all, because he's involved in the stopping the expansion of the Moors into Europe, and that would be similar to these Trung sisters. So when you walk in, when you finish the building dedicated to the defeat of the Chinese, you enter into a large plaza, and in that large plaza you see this sculpture, which is the fuselage of a B-52 bomber and the wreckage associated with the bombs that had dropped. And that is a large sculpture, maybe the largest three-dimensional sculpture I've ever seen. And very interesting display. So there's the tail of a B-52. I can assure you the United States did not donate that. And various wreckage associated with the bombing. You walk next into a building that's dedicated to the defeat of the French in 1954. The French occupied and colonized Vietnam from the middle of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th century. And the primary exhibit, I would have to say the heart of the museum, is the war against the French. And the end of that exhibit, you climb and you go up to the second or third story, probably a second story, and at the end there's a diorama and a film of the siege of Dien Bien Phu. And you see video images of people walking up, many women walking up through the jungle. Here's an example of it, these bicycles laden with equipment, artillery pieces broken down into little bits, and they walk them through the jungle undetected by the French and reassemble them over many months so that they can rain artillery down on the French at Dien Bien Phu. Of course, the French chose Dien Bien Phu because they thought it was untouchable. Nobody would go into the jungle and assemble artillery pieces up there. Nobody would do that. And how did they do it? On walking bicycles over months. Beyond the imagination of the French. Beyond the imagination of the French. And of course, when they finished preparing for that siege, there was nothing the French could do. And they surrendered. That's what I learned partly when I went there. I'll tell one other story. The first place we stopped was the Vietnam Veterans Association in Saigon, an association of South Vietnamese, association of Viet Minh veterans living in Saigon. Veterans who were fighting in the regular army of Hanoi. And I asked a question after we were heard from a general who was telling us his story. And I said to the general, I said, what happened to the former Viet Cong guerrillas at the end of the war? And this guy started yelling at me in Vietnamese and yelled at me and yelled at me and yelled at me, kind of aggressively. Felt like it was longer than it was, I'm sure. And there was this translator, this very kind of nice translator, and after this guy yelled at me for a long time, he said, what do you mean by Viet Cong? And I said, well, I mean all those forces that opposed American involvement, from irregular guerrillas in the South to religious sects to gang activity to Buddhists, anyone who opposed the presence of the United States. And then he goes, oh, okay, And then he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, we are all Viet Cong. And then afterwards, he had the translator sit down with me for half an hour, holding my hand and telling me the history of the war in Vietnam. He came later to our hotel. I spent time with him at the hotel, and we engaged in correspondence for 15 years. This colonel who had learned French, and in 1954 was told by the Vietnamese government, time to learn English, and served as a translator through the entire war. And if people are interested, I have a copy of the official Vietnamese position on the war. He gave me a book, signed it where the Vietnamese tell their own story in English. Those are the things that I learned kind of when I traveled to Vietnam, to think of Vietnam as a place, as a country, as a nation, where the United States went and knew very little, and didn't feel like we had to know much. And if you think about lessons learned, to me, that's the most important lesson learned. If we're going to spend blood and treasure, we ought to know a lot about the places where we're going to do it, if we're not attacked directly. You know, obviously, if we're attacked directly, I don't think there's really much wiggle room. You got to hit back, you know. But in the event that you have to travel to do it, you should know more about the place you're going. So I want to talk briefly about how I understand the U.S. involvement in the war. I would just say, generally speaking, the Vietnam War was understood differently by Americans and the Vietnamese. Americans saw the war as a struggle between the free world and the communists. U.S. planners understood communism as a monolithic movement originating out of Moscow, separating the free world from the communist world. Fighting the communists in Vietnam there was holding the line against an expansive Soviet Union. It was simply an application of the doctrine of containment set out by George Kennan and others to stop communism where it already existed. The war from the Vietnamese perspective was seen as a struggle for national liberation. Communism in Vietnam was not necessarily part of a global movement set on world revolution. It was part of a nationalist movement that had its origins in an ancient culture, which had always tried to maintain its independence from China, and then from the French, and also from the Japanese in between. When the United States took over the struggle for a non-communist Vietnam, we were seen as imperialists, and we were seen as very much like continuing the legacy of the French. That is not to suggest that North Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh were not communists. They were sincere communists. But Ho Chi Minh also attempted, to the degree that he was able, to make peace with the United States in 1945 and later. In Vietnam, then, we can see the complexity of America's post-war diplomacy. Ultimately, Americans would have to come to terms with a policy that claimed to protect freedom as against the slavery of communism, even while supporting the explicitly imperialist control of the French and later governments that were far from the liberal ideal that we said that we were supporting. Americans were faced with two alternatives: accept anti-communism as the equivalent of freedom, regardless of the kind of anti-communist governments we supported, or give up the pretext that America supported freedom and accept that we were, like other nations, a military power involved in a global struggle for markets and power. And I think, again, we can look back on those choices today. In the current war on terror, are all of our allies freedom fighters? Is the United States always on the side of freedom? Why do Americans fight wars? What does it mean to be patriotic? All those questions we asked in the 1950s and 60s, we could ask again. So America's direct involvement can be traced back to Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. And I want to kind of start there, and I'll get us through Eisenhower and then hand the baton off to the next people. During the 1940s, the Ho Chi Minh returned after a long exile to Vietnam to help liberate the Vietnamese people from the Chinese. When the French were defeated by the Nazis, the French control in Vietnam was ceded to the Japanese. And the Japanese took over for the French in Vietnam, and as cruel as the French were, and I just have to say that the Vietnamese really don't like the French, didn't like French occupation even a little bit. The Japanese occupation was extremely tough during the war. And actually Burns notes that in the documentary. And Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam to help in the struggle of the Vietnamese to liberate them from Japanese occupation. While he is fighting the Japanese, he is helping the United States. He is helping the United States return down pilots. He's fighting the Japanese, and we're fighting the Japanese. He develops a close relationship with the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. And American officials are training the Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, his army, in the use of weapons, providing them with supplies, giving them a code name, giving them weapons, and basically they're allies. At the end of the war, at that time, of course, the United States is fighting with the Soviet Union, for goodness sake. Communism wasn't a problem in the 1940s for us. Following the war, Ho Chi Minh writes a series of letters to Harry Truman asking for his support in maintaining an independent Vietnam free of French control. Harry Truman responds to none of the letters. So if one is looking for exits from Vietnam, obviously the easiest exit would have been Harry Truman's to basically told the French, give up your lost empire in Vietnam. We're not going to back you.
May I ask a question right now?
Mm-hmm.
When the French ceded Vietnam to the Japanese, I'm backing up just a little bit. Was that willingly?
Oh God, no. I don't think they really asked permission. I think when Paris fell, the Germans took all the not just Vietnam, they took the entire French Empire.
No choice but to lose it.
Well, I don't think the Germans asked. Yeah, of course the French did. They had their resistance. And they, but yeah, I think
I didn't quite get that picture.
No, no. Yeah, okay. When the Germans took control of Paris and the French government fell, the French Empire then, the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese kind of divided it up. And that's why there was that's why there was the campaigns in North Africa and all that was in French territory. Yeah, French. Yeah, and of course in Asia the French Empire went to the Japanese, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the French didn't. The French. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not a story we know much about. When we think about World War II, we don't think about what happened to the French Empire. It's just not something we think much about. I think in North Africa and Vietnam they think about it, but it's not something that we think much about. But it had these enormous consequences. It put us in an early alliance with the Viet Minh, in a way that also most people don't know. So the Viet Minh is the army that's run out of Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh's military wing would be called the army. I don't know what they call themselves up there, but the Viet Minh Army is the army in the north.
Thank you.
I remember one time I had a little personal audience with Daniel Ellsberg. The best part of teaching at Southwest Minnesota State is when famous speakers come, they have to get to the airport, So sometimes you have to drive these famous people 3 hours in a car. And I asked Ellsberg why Truman didn't respond. Because to me at the time I was in a car with him, that was the most important question that I had, because it seemed like the easiest exit. And Ellsberg said, well, that's simple, Jeff. The United States was primarily interested in reindustrializing Germany and reindustrializing Japan, right? That we wanted to have bulwarks against communism in Central Europe and a bulwark against communism in the Pacific. And the French were opposed to the reindustrialization of Germany. They favored the famous Morgenthau Plan, which was the pasteurization of Germany, to turn Germany into Europe's dairy land, make every German a dairy farmer, and not to reindustrialize it. And in exchange for French support for a reindustrialized Germany, the French said, you'll have to support us to reclaim our lost empire in Vietnam and in North Africa. So we traded our support for an explicitly imperialist adventure in Asia and North Africa in exchange for French support for our Cold War goals in Central Europe. And at the time, who could have thought that the United States would spend all those years from 54 to 75 or 54 to 73 fighting in Vietnam? We had just defeated the French and the Japanese and the Italians in a two-ocean war, a multi-front war. Who could have imagined we'd get bogged down in Vietnam? So the kind of thinking that led to it was the thinking of men who had enormous power, and making that trade seem to make sense to them, not knowing what would happen 10 years down the line. So that decision by Truman in 45 was important. But what's more important is that when we make the decision, we don't tell America that we're supporting the French to reclaim their lost empire. We say that the French struggle is part of the struggle for freedom against communism. And we believe it. We believe it. We believe it. Truman didn't say we were supporting the French colonial cause. Eisenhower didn't say we were supporting the French colonial cause. They were part of the struggle for freedom. And that's part of what kind of unravels when you begin to study what happened there. In early 1945, Ho Chi Minh founded the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. At the celebration, American military officers stood and saluted the new flag of North Vietnam. A Vietnamese band played the Star-Spangled Banner, and Ho began his own speech by quoting from the Declaration of Independence. The easiest exit was 1945. And we didn't take it. And I don't think we could have imagined the direction that it turned. Instead of forming that alliance, the Allies followed plans set forth for Vietnam at the Potsdam Conference, which called for the Chinese to disarm the Japanese in the north and the English to do so in the south. And the English were favorable to the French, and as they disarmed the Japanese, they allowed the French to return in the south. After about a year, the Chinese relinquished control in the north to the Viet Minh, and the war for Vietnamese independence began again, this time against the French instead of against Japanese occupation, and the United States began to support the French. The French installed a Vietnamese, this guy here, Bao Dai. Bao Dai was a educated man, more comfortable speaking French than Vietnamese, and was essentially complicit in the occupation of Vietnam by the French, put a Vietnamese face on the French occupation. The U.S. took no formal position on the war until February 1950, when the Truman administration recognized the Bao Dai government. On May 24, 1950, Truman allocated $10,000 to France for its war to reclaim its lost empire in Southeast Asia. America had decided at that point with dollars that anti-communism was more important than anti-colonialism. Throughout the remainder of his term, Truman supported the French effort to the tune of $10 million a year. When Eisenhower took office in 1953, he said, quote, "We are proposing to make substantial additional resources available to the French and associated states in their military effort to defeat the communist Viet Minh aggression," end quote. Eisenhower put our money where his mouth was and increased the aid to $400 million a year, or 78% of the cost of the total French effort. So by 1953, we had hired the French to fight the war in Vietnam. Eisenhower said publicly, and one has to understand the enormous popularity of Dwight Eisenhower, the extraordinary credibility that he had with the American people, calling the French effort a war to defeat Viet Minh aggression. I mean, so I don't think I have to tell you the irony of that. how could the French possibly fight Viet Minh aggression? The Viet Minh were from Vietnam. How could the French be anything other than aggressors in Vietnam? For Eisenhower, the cost of aid to the French was justified because he saw Vietnam as the key domino in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately for the Americans, the French needed more than our money to defeat the Viet Minh. And on May 7, 1954, after a 55-day siege in Dien Bien Phu, the French surrendered, and the next day serious talks began to end the conflict. On July 20th and 21st, 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed, creating an armistice that America refused to take part in the signing, although we did promise not to use force to upset the agreements and to support free elections in Vietnam. The Accords called for a temporary partition of Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with the French withdrawing south of that line. And that in itself is an extraordinary story of huge migrations of people up and down the Vietnam, communists going north and Catholics going south, and communists staying south, and a huge disruption of human life. Neither the French nor the Viet Minh could join a military alliance or allow foreign military bases on their territory. There would be elections supervised by a joint commission of India, Canada, and Poland within 2 years to unify the country. Of course, that was a kind of classic Soviet stooge in Poland, a US stooge in Canada, and then a non-aligned nation in India to kind of make it fair. The unification of the country was crucial for the North, as they had always depended on the South for a good bit of their food supply. So one has to understand that Vietnam was always kind of, or for hundreds of years, was one nation, not two. And it was like the United States that has regions that do different things. The South was the kind of rice basket or bread basket of Vietnam. And the idea of North Vietnam being severed from its primary source of food from the South was an unacceptable position for the North. Completely unimaginable. Americans were disappointed at the French and the Geneva Accords and looked for a possible solution to the problems inherent in the failure of the French to stem the tide of communism. As it was apparent to everyone that free elections would result in a communist victory, Eisenhower himself believed that Ho would have gotten 80% of the vote. Ho Chi Minh was, at that time, in 1954, had worked to defeat the Japanese, was involved in victory against the Japanese, had spent 9 years fighting the French and expelling the French, and was essentially the George Washington of Vietnam. That's not to say that he had universal support, but was an enormously popular figure at the time. The elections were never held. After a ceasefire, Army Chief of Staff General Martin Ridgway, who was a very important military figure at the time, I think he took over from MacArthur in Korea, went to Vietnam to size up the situation. Ridgway was a respected military man with a kind of a bit of a swagger. I understand that he used to wear a necklace of live grenades around his neck, just to kind of prove kind of the kind of guy he was. But his conclusion was that a military intervention would be costly, but that he did not oppose it. Ridgway estimated that it would be a foot soldiers' war, taking between 500,000 and 1 million men, and require the seizure of a Chinese island off the coast of Vietnam, meaning that to defeat Vietnam would require that we go to war with China. That was the most respected military analyst's position in 1955. To defeat to win in Vietnam would have required going to war with China. Before I show a little bit of the clip, I want to say one last thing, and then we'll open it up to questions. And this is maybe the most important thing that's commonly not understood. So let me just ask you, we can take several answers. what would victory have looked like in Vietnam? How would we have known we had won for the United States? What was the goal? That's easier. What was the goal? What?
To win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese, say life is going to be good.
Yeah, we would have taken less than that, but that would have been, that was the ultimate goal, to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese. All the Vietnamese?
No,
Which
majority.
The majority. Mm-hmm. Joan?
Well, they were really just expecting to have a functioning South Vietnam, isn't that true?
Functioning South Vietnam? I think they wanted more than a functioning South Vietnam.
You think they wanted the North?
No. But what did they want in terms of South Vietnam? But they wanted a non-communist South Vietnam.
But I mean, what I mean is that they were constantly trying to find leaders who could actually function.
Well, they wanted that. They wanted that, but I think they wanted more than that. They wanted more than functional leaders. I think they wanted a non-communist South Vietnam that did not require the presence of American troops. Yeah. So they wanted a South Vietnam that could stand on its own. I don't think they really cared necessarily how good the leaders were, although it would have helped to have good ones. Yeah. I think what we could have withdrawn and said that we won if we could have removed our troops from South Vietnam and South Vietnam had remained an independent nation, a non-communist. Very important that it be non-communist, independent nation. The United States opposed all the way through the war something called neutrality. That was a South Vietnam that was neutral on the question of communism. We opposed that. It had to be a non-communist or anti-communist Vietnam, South Vietnam. We never intended to take the war to the north. Yeah.
Just to clarify, what are the other dominoes in the domino theory? Is it Japan itself might go communist?
Well, Japan would have been a very late domino. It would have been Laos, Cambodia, Thailand for sure. What?
Went south,
Yeah.
even
In India. Yeah. So it would have gone the other way. Like San Francisco would have been a very late domino. Yeah. So, but certainly Laos, Cambodia for absolute certain. Of course, Laos had already kind of gone. But Cambodia and Thailand would have been next. Essentially, it would have gone that way. Mm-hmm.
Japan was very weak, then it would have been.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't have allowed it either. But I just want us to understand that the goal, now I want you to think about this for a minute. If the goal was an independent South Vietnam, non-communist South Vietnam that could stand on its own without the presence of U.S. troops, was that achievable? Was that an achievable goal? And I ask you to consider that the United States created South Vietnam. There had never been a place called South Vietnam until 1954. The Republic of South Vietnam is created in 1954. It has no historical origins. It has no roots. It was a nation created out of whole cloth along a border that was drawn in Geneva that had no historical or geographic logic to it, along a parallel. In order to save Vietnam from communism, we had to create it. We had to create the nation in order to save it. Yeah?
How much was the division of Korea in the policymakers' mind, do you think?
Yeah, there were several places that were divided at the end of World War II. Vietnam really Germany was divided into four. Berlin was divided into four. Yeah. Iran, they didn't figure out, and I think what happened at Potsdam is they just didn't figure things out before the conference ended. So you divided Korea, you divided Iran, not because there was some great strategy behind it, but you hadn't quite gotten there yet and figured out how you were going to do it. And so, but again, the thinking was that there would be elections to unify the nation within 2 years. So it was a temporary partition in order to end the conflict. But if you think about one thing, if you get one thing out of this, think about this idea that South Vietnam, The goal was an independent South Vietnam, non-communist, that could stand on its own without the presence of US troops. And in order to create that thing, in order to do that, we had to create the nation. And then say, now, protect yourself against the North. Well, I mean, you wouldn't, And if they had said to moms in 1962 or 63, this is what we want to send your sons to do, what would the moms have said? But I'm not making that up. And you can go back and retrace my steps, and you can go back and read all of the evidence. That's the reality.
Well, that's what we were all told. I mean, I graduated from high school in '68, and probably half of our classmates went, because it was a draft.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we were all told.
Was what?
That, this was the way we're going to prevent communism
Yeah.
from spreading.
Mm-hmm. When in fact, it was everywhere. Communism was everywhere in Vietnam. Yeah, it was one country. We had to bust it up into two in order to create a place to save. And then, of course, we know later when the U.S. goes in there and said, well, we had to destroy the village in order to save it, right? But in order to save the South Vietnam from communism, first we had to create it. Then we had to destroy it in order to save it. So when you think about exits from Vietnam, and a lot of us think about Kennedy, or most of us think about Johnson, by the time it got to Lyndon Johnson in '65, we were so deep in, not just deep in policy-wise, not just more troops, we were deep into the lie by that time. So if you're looking for easy exits, Johnson should have and could have gotten out in '65. Should have and could have, but it would have been much harder for him than Truman in '45 or Eisenhower in '54. All Eisenhower had to do was obey a legally negotiated treaty, the Geneva Accords, instead of creating South Vietnam, calling it free, and then causing the United States to defend that proposition all those years, 54 through 73 or 75, wherever you want to date it. So I want to show a little bit of the clip now, about 10 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. I watched several times the whole first one. I would like to have shown an hour of the documentary. But you can actually, if you join Pioneer Public Television, you can watch it to your heart's delight on, what's it called? What's that little service you have? Passport. Passport's a delight. Yeah. And I wanted to leave to later sessions the escalation of the war when the American presence was much more on the ground. And I wanted us to focus tonight primarily on the path to Vietnam and what led us there. And so with that, I open it up to your thoughts, your comments, your observations, your questions.
I had a couple questions. So just to be clear, that artillery that the Viet Minh were using was Russian or was it Chinese?
That's a good question. I would imagine that it was probably Russian. I don't know the answer to that. What we do know is that one of the things we've learned that's caused us to think differently about the nature of the Viet Minh is that after the fall of communism, we have much better records about the relationship of both the Soviets and the Chinese and the roles they played in the defeat of the United States by the Viet Minh. There were many, many Chinese, hundreds of thousands, that participated in the rebuilding of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, for example. I would imagine, but I don't know specifically. It would have been, but they would have been Eastern European, Chinese, or Russian, or Soviet. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't know the answer. Do you know?
No, I don't.
Yeah, that's a good question, though.
And then the other question, I guess, is, I guess I'm a believer that politicians actually respond to the desires of capitalists. So what were the what was the French colony exporting from Vietnam? Why was it a valuable colony? What was being exported?
Oh, for the French themselves.
Yeah, what?
Okay.
What type of materials?
Rubber. Strictly latex, period. It was a sinkhole. They never made it out the whole time they were there. It was a playground.
Right, and I think
Rubber, latex.
So what about oil?
Rice.
wasn't about oil. What I would ask you to think about is what I would ask you to think about. Well, I mean, the French themselves, but some individuals got rich. You know, whatever the Michelin family or whatever might have.
Rubber.
Yeah. So, but the French, it was a losing effort, you know, but in terms of, but all colonialism was essentially a sinkhole. But I think we have to understand that for the French and for the British, they did not go down easily. In other words, they clung to their empires, and they clung to their empires because their national identity was tied to it. You know, the sun doesn't set on the English Empire and the larger Greater France into North Africa. Why did the French hold on so tightly to Algeria? If all they got out of Vietnam was latex, what were they getting from Algeria?
Well, it was Indochina too. I mean,
Yeah.
it was Laos,
Cambodia,
and Vietnam was
together.
all French
Was all
colony.
French, right.
Yeah, that was.
And so when these countries had to give up their empires after 1945, there was an extraordinary gut-wrenching feeling about what are we now. Like the French defined themselves to some degree as an empire. The British defined themselves to some degree as an empire. And so it wasn't just, are we making money on it? It was, how do we define ourselves as a nation absent that empire? What made England powerful? What made France powerful? What made them a great nation? And to some degree, it was the consciousness of themselves as a world power that controlled space around the globe. And they competed for that space, whether they made money off it or not. So I think we have to understand that to some degree, this imperial mindset played a role independent of who was making money or losing money on the enterprise. I think to some degree, these colonial enterprises were money losers, but they provided a kind of national identity to the people. You don't find that satisfying?
Mm.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I've seen a colonial extractive economy that enriched individuals,
Mm-hmm.
the Carnegies or whoever you want, the people to support, and then they control the politicians to say, you need to protect my interests.
Yeah, there's that. I mean, there's no doubt that there were huge rubber plantations in Vietnam, and this particular documentary doesn't do as good a job, but if you go back and look at the first episode of the older one called Vietnam and Television History, which is superb. There you'll see pictures of them. I mean, they took pictures of it. But you'll also see documentaries. If you look at, for example, the very famous documentary called Hearts and Minds, which is an Academy Award winner. They'll show images of documentaries that the French showed their children about the importance of this empire, the importance of France spreading around the globe. So I just say that it's not all economics. It's not all economics. And I would ask all of us to think, is it possible that at some point the dollar will not be the world dominant currency?
Yes.
How many people should die to maintain that? Will the United States go down any easier than France if another nation rises up to challenge us as the dominant economic power? And is that just about money? And I say that because look at England now. England is no longer a world power like it was. Who's been to England? Who's been to the UK? Only Joan? Is it such a bad place? Can you still get a steak and a baked potato? You know?
I don't know about that.
Yeah, you can get a steak and kidney pie or whatever. You can get a passage, but I'm saying all over Europe, which is no longer is not the dominant nations that they were in the early part of the 20th century, still pretty habitable spots, right? Still pretty habitable places. But they clung to that image of themselves as the top dog.
I suppose, because they held it for a long time.
And they got used to that.
They liked those glory days.
But they left a lot behind as well. Culture, English culture, French culture in Vietnam today.
How are the baguettes in Hanoi?
Oh, well, they're great in Saigon. I mean, no, but I mean, they left things. They left forms of government all over the world. England still has their colonies that are no more colonies, still have English courts,
Correct.
English way of law.
Left the English language.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, they did leave something behind. There's no doubt about that. But what I'm saying is that in every case they were forced out, you know. But what I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that 100% of colonialism is about protecting the interests of the capitalist class. I think that to some degree, average Americans who gain nothing from the power of the dollar want the United States to be the top dog. Deep down, many Americans do. That's the patriotism piece. And if your patriotism is tied to empire in very explicit ways, if your knowledge of what it means to be French is tied to colonial possessions, just as an average Frenchman, those are important dimensions. Yeah.
Why were the Japanese worse than the?
Well, they were under wartime exigencies. I mean, they created huge amounts of starvation. They took all the rice. I mean, everything. I mean, you know, you don't know what the Japanese Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere would have been like absent fierce, brutal warfare. But what we do know is how it operated during the war. And
So you believe it was more for the rice, for the food source, for their armies?
Everything. It wasn't just the rice. They took everything, man. Okay. Everything. Yeah. I mean, there was starvation, you know, in Vietnam. So I guess what I'm saying is that the Japanese were fighting for their lives, and they wherever they were, they took whatever they could.
Jeff?
Yeah.
What role did finance capitalism play? You know, we've talked about, you know, the holdings of corporations or individuals. What about finance? That's another sector of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's a good question. I mean, I don't. You know, I would say that to some degree the war was financed. The U.S. deficits began. The taxation couldn't pay for both guns and butter during the Johnson years and the Nixon years. But I think in these early years, I don't know that finance capitalism was behind it. There's discussions of what they call a permanent war economy. I don't talk about it here, but in 1950, the United States passes something called NSC 68, National Security Council Document 68, a top secret document that called for the United States to spend 5% of its total wealth on the military, understanding that as the U.S. economy grew, the capacity of the United States to expand its military power grew. And that passed. I mean, we did that. And that was financed. In other words, banks lent money to these, and that was a good business to get into because there was always a market for those products, aircraft, bombs, artillery, tanks, boots. Mm-hmm. So you know, so there is that element that sees U.S. Military adventurism as tied to that element of the U.S. economy that generates the weapons of war and profits off the sales of those weapons. And they certainly have their lobbyists, and they certainly are powerful forces. That would be independent of, say, finance capital. I want to go to Joan first, and then you, Mike. You had your hand up. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I think another aspect of finance capitalism, you can see it in our relationship with China, starting way in the 19th century. That belief that China was this incredible market for our products, and our love affair with China before it became communist was two-pronged. One, as a potential market, and two, as a place to Christianize.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the two groups that formed the China lobby, supported Chiang Kai-shek, and if you want to see the power of that kind of thinking in colonialism vis-a-vis the Europeans, I read a book last year called Lawrence in Arabia. It's not exclusively about Lawrence of Arabia, but it shows during the height of World War I, when Europe was tearing itself apart, not even quite knowing what the end result was going to be. There was a French diplomat there trying to get control of Syria after the war as the Ottoman Turkish Empire was collapsing. The Brits were there, the French were there, Israeli was there, Standard Oil was there. They were all thinking about what the map in the Mideast was going to look like after World War I, before they even knew they were going to win World War I.
Yeah.
Powerful, just to accentuate what you were saying, that idea of we're great because we have an empire, and we have markets all over the world, and places we can invest.
There's some of that out there. It depends how you define yourself as a nation. What's the core of your national identity? And for some, it is this sense of national purpose. And for us, it's always tied to freedom. That wherever we go, no matter what we do, we're spreading freedom. And and of course, even in the documentary, you saw it at the very end. The French are stemming the red tide by maintaining their empire. Really. And I think people believe that. Yeah.
I mean, if you think also this is the point where at home anti-communism is at its fiercest.
Oh God.
And McCarthy is, with 54 is the only McCarthy trials or hearings. So before that, he really held sway to it.
Yeah. So it's easy to sell the anti-communist piece.
Well, and I think they may have believed it too.
Mhm.
I mean, do you think?
I don't think they believe.
Do you assume that they were really fairly cynical about it?
I think they were interested in stopping the spread of communism. I don't think they had any interest in spreading freedom. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know that they thought that. I mean, and even Franklin Roosevelt, I think, sincerely believed that the Vietnamese weren't ready for freedom. I mean, he thought they needed to be they needed some kind of, and that's where you get these notions in the Middle East of what do they call them? Not protectorates, but protectorates. Where they weren't quite colonies, but they weren't quite free, and so there was all that kind of racism associated with it as well. That at one point they'll be ready, and we'll just kind of use the French as a means of easing them into a more free society. But I don't think they were cynical about stopping communism. I think they were cynical about freedom. They had no interest in extending freedom to anything other than maybe Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm.
Jim, what's your speculation about, it's been debated a lot, and historians don't always like hypotheticals, but Kennedy, you didn't mention much about his decision vis-a-vis Vietnam, and whether you think that if he had lived, would he have ever followed the kind of path that LBJ did?
I've thought about it, and my feeling is, based on what I've read, is that he would have. That when he took office, there were about 10,000 troops, and when he left, there were 60,000 or so. I have the numbers in my notes. I could look them up and give you the exact numbers. But all he did was deepen U.S. involvement. That's all he did. I mean, I see no evidence of him having done anything else. He created the Green Beret and this notion of special forces as a solution to the guerrilla warfare. So my feeling is that he would have gotten dragged deeper and deeper into that special forces approach. It would have failed for many of the reasons that Joan's suggesting, a failure of the South Vietnamese government to operate even remotely in the interest of the South Vietnamese people. And eventually he would have been forced to escalate. More Americans would have died and he would have been dragged in. That's my feeling. I know other people say he was about ready to pull out and he got killed just before he could do it. But he doesn't leave a record of that. His record is one of continued escalation.
I was just going to say too that I know Lyndon Johnson was haunted by the idea of being the first president to lose it.
Right. Oh God, yeah.
I think Kennedy would have had exactly that same concern.
Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, you had Nixon out there. Would have anti-communist. It would have red baited them. I mean, So they say Nixon was the only person that could have gone to China, because if anybody else had gone to China, there would have been Richard Nixon attacking them for going to China, right? So yeah, I think you're right. I don't think, I think he would have followed that path, you know. Yeah.
I think I noticed on the television presentation that at the end of 1967, there's a conversation between former President Dwight Eisenhower and President Johnson. It's on one of the tapes. And Johnson is beside himself with all these folks that, you know, are protesting the war. And it's going to harm the effort, and we're not going to be able to prosecute the war. And I believe that Eisenhower died a couple years later. And I wonder, you know, if he ever regretted not telling Lyndon Johnson, just pull the plug on
Well,
this.
you know, Johnson knew. Humphrey, he sent Humphrey there right at the beginning of his presidency. And Humphrey came back and said, it's a loser, don't do it. And what happened to Hubert? He wasn't allowed into a cabinet meeting for 2 years. Robert McNamara admits that he knew 6 months after the escalation it was a loser. In 65, McNamara knew it was a loser. 65. He admits that. If Robert McNamara admits that in his memoir, he knew it when he knew it on the first day. The reason I showed you the video of Dien Bien Phu, who would have followed the French there to fight those guys? Why would you go there after they did that? And you knew, and Eisenhower knew they'd done that.
So why not?
Well, we're not the French, and they're just the Vietnamese.
We followed the French to Panama, the Panama Canal.
Yeah, that one we got right. Yeah,
We thought we were better than that.
yeah.
But still, I mean, it's always going to be.
It's hubris. Yeah, you know, there are two. I know two of the books that you put out there. Well, I know this. I actually know three of them. I didn't see this one. The Stanley Carno, solid one-volume history of the war, absolutely exhaustive and solid. Can't recommend it highly enough. A little bit shorter, Marilyn Young, Vietnam Wars. Couldn't find a better one-volume history of the war. Another one, perfectly good one-volume history of the war. I highly recommend it. And there's one other one I recommend by a guy named Christian Appy. If you want one that's really kind of almost, you can't put it down. It's called Patriots by Christian Appy. Can't recommend that one highly enough. I'm sure it's very cheap. The library almost certainly can afford it. It's just a series of oral histories. Many, many, many oral histories of the war. And they're extraordinary. None of them longer than 5 pages. And you just can't put it down. I highly recommend that book. And the second oral history in the book is of a Vietnamese general, commanding general. And he tells the story of how the Viet Minh wanted to attack a highway. And so they started planting cassava over a period of years, moving closer and closer to the highway, so that when they did the attack on the highway, they would have food to eat. I mean, how do you beat an army like that? They used to say that everybody knew one day the United States would leave. Unless we made Vietnam the 51st state, they were going to win. That's their home. They're planting cassava over a period of years to attack a highway. And this general said, I want to tell you a song we sang, you know. And they sang a song about every cassava plant is one American GI dead. And they would sing that song as they planted cassava. And I'll just say this to you. The Vietnamese don't eat cassava unless they have to. They eat rice. That's what I'm saying. So when we knew that they had done that in Dien Bien Phu, and still, we make a commitment there.
And they knew how fierce the Japanese were, so it wasn't like they could write off all Asians as ineffective immigrants.
You talked about David McNamara a little bit. Didn't he write in his book, in retrospect, that the war was wrong?
Mm-hmm.
He openly admits, well, everybody's dead that was around him, so he writes this book, if I remember right.
Yep, in retrospect, he writes that the war was wrong and that he knew within 6 months, that's where he writes, that within 6 months of the escalation, he knew it was a loser. That's why I don't really believe that it took him 6 months to figure that out. He probably knew it.
It goes with the incredible line, though, the McNamara line.
Yeah. So all of the, this is the beginning of what will be a longer discussion about American involvement in Vietnam. I ask us to think about it carefully over the next many, many months. I ask us to ask those questions of where we are now. Are we going to make Iraq the 51st state? Are we going to make Afghanistan the 51st state? And if we're not, what does victory look like in Afghanistan?
Opinion, you talked about we didn't know history of Vietnam with took one of all the people that fought it back in the day. Are we making the same mistake in the Middle East, in your opinion, that we're not knowing history?
I think we don't know it as well as we should. I think that we go into places assuming that everyone wants to be like us. The principal assumption of Americans is that everyone wants to be like us.
Everybody wants a Pepsi.
Everybody wants Pepsi, or they want Coke, or they want freedom, and they want it just like we want it.
And we went into Afghanistan knowing that everybody else.
Yeah, we went into Afghanistan. It was the graveyard of empires. The British, the Soviets. Yeah. And that's where we are now. So I ask us, how many Pashtun speakers did we have when we went in there? And so what I'm saying is that we need to ask, we need to understand that not everybody's like us. And not everybody wants to be like us. They might want a little of us, but maybe not all of us. And if we don't begin to understand that the world is not like us, we will continue to go down paths that are maybe aren't the wisest ones. The young people in college today have not had one conscious minute of peacetime. 1999, or 2001, the war, October 7th, my birthday, 2001, the war in Afghanistan began. And that's how many years ago? 16 years ago. So the freshman class was 2.
But do they feel connected at all to these wars? I mean, that's what you read, that they really don't, people in the
Got some young people in the room.
country don't feel.
I think a lot of them know people that served. Yeah. A lot of them know people that served or are serving or have served themselves. But what I'm saying is this one's gone on almost the entire adult life of an 18-year-old.
But the other difference is that in Vietnam, you could get drafted. And now that it's a volunteer army, that's a huge difference.
And of course,
as far as attention.
And of course, the decision to go to a volunteer army was completely the result of the Vietnam War. The other thing is that you cannot move a truck or anything without mobilizing the National Guard now. And the U.S. Army made sure that you could not fight a war without the National Guard. That was a direct connection to the fact that the Guard didn't go and serve in Vietnam. They wanted the U.S. population to be involved. And so they insisted that the U.S. Army can't function without mobilizing the Guard. It can't, the way that's organized. There are many ramifications of this war that we don't think about. Many ramifications of how the military operates, the decision to go to an all-volunteer force, all that's directly tied back. Other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
You probably covered it, but the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I'm from Minnesota. 6 young men died that were from Minnesota, 7 had a Minnesota address. I went to the Veterans Day activity a week ago on Wednesday because Minnesota sports teams do all right, but those 6 young men forfeited their lives, you know, and I don't know, you probably said the total number of Americans that died in Vietnam was like 58,728, whatever it was in that vicinity. And the gentleman that spoke that day at the Veterans Day, you know, had been in 82nd Airborne and related his personal story of, you know, how when he came home, that people totally disrespected him in abysmal ways, and it should not have happened to anyone because people were doing what they were duty bound to do. But on the other hand, people were protesting the war. And I guess have people stop to consider the fact that if it was indeed 58,728 that died in Vietnam, if nobody had protested the war, does anybody have an idea of how long the war may have gone on? And could it be possible that another 100,000, so 158,728 would have died? Would have that have been better? Because what if we secured a victory out of the extra 100,000 that died?
I think the anti-war movement played a role in hastening the end of the war. I don't know that it alone can explain it. It wasn't just the anti-war movement. The actual military itself began, the desertion rate went way up. The military began to disobey orders. It became dangerous for commanding officers to order men into dangerous situations. Many American commanding officers were killed by their servicemen. So the capacity of command and control of the U.S. military, independent of anti-war activity at home, caused the U.S. to withdraw. The capacity of the U.S. to actually carry on the war from a military perspective was in question.
Blacks couldn't go into white areas in Saigon?
Yeah,
True story.
I believe that. So the anti-war movement played a role. The military itself was the what? Well, the U.S. was completely alone. I mean, we had South Korea, and I mean, there was almost nobody, almost no allies. I mean, the coalition of the willing was minuscule in Vietnam. But the anti-war movement played a role. But as importantly as the anti-war movement, it became unpopular against many, many Americans who never protested in the streets. It lost popular support. And when I was little, we didn't think our president would lie to us, you know. We believed what they told us, you know. And I just think the credibility of any president now, we all know that they're lying to us, you know, some of the time, you know. And I mean, we do, you know. And the reality is we know now that there's some things they can't tell us, you know, like the nuclear stuff. So we've built a secret government, and we kind of deep down we know it, you know. So this credibility gap created that you know, you can trace back to Truman and then to Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, you know. So that it wasn't just the anti-war movement; it was the failure of what our leaders were telling us, and what our soldiers coming back were telling us, what our leaders were telling us, and what was being broadcast on television, just didn't jibe.
So what point did the media take? What did they play? What role in this big picture called Vietnam? It was the first one we ever seen in our homes.
For a long time.
But did they sway the war?
They played a role, you know. But one has to understand that when we think about Vietnam, there's another thing I ask you to consider. The United States was involved in Vietnam in a significant way, let's say between 43 and 75. Between the alliance with the Viet Minh during World War II till the U.S. finally withdrew completely in the fall of Saigon in 75. The U.S. military, the U.S. media parroted everything the administration said through about 66 or 67.
But did not Johnson make the statement, and I may be wrong, if I've lost Walter, I've lost America?
Yeah, that's in 68.
Okay, 60, yes, 60.
That's in 68. Johnson's got 1 year left.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is the media was on board utterly and completely till about 68. That's not to say that there weren't reporters working for magazines, the New Yorker, what's his name, Seymour Hersh, and others who were doing investigative reporting somewhat earlier. But the network news, the newspapers, the vast bulk of the reporting was positive. And of course, the American public supported the war through 66 and 67, largely. Yeah.
Yeah, my brother was in Vietnam. He's a Marine officer. I remember particularly one letter he sent me saying, he says, I always thought that when I got over here, this war would make more sense to me. It actually makes less sense to me. And I think that was a frustration of a lot of soldiers, that they capture something and then they retreat from it, and they sometimes had to capture the same as the Vietnam series showed so well, that it was hard to know what victory meant there for the people actually fighting the war on the U.S. side.
To me, that's the saddest part, you know. And that's why I want us to think about what the policy was and what who the decision makers were, who asked us to send our young people into that, and for what? To save a nation we created from something they didn't even want. You know, and to me that's what I spared myself studying this. You know, I really conspicuously avoided it until I was probably 30. You know, and practically completed my PhD without having to learn about it. You know, if I hadn't gotten a class to teach, I would have finished without having really had to learn about it. But since that time, I felt a kind of moral obligation, you know, to read and to learn and to share what I've learned. And yeah.
Getting back to the media, don't you think the big, regardless of the viewpoint of the media, the important thing was that the war was brought into our living rooms, and you know, the government learned from that, so that right now the media is very strictly controlled, and we don't see the war in Iraq.
We don't see Afghanistan. We don't see the and you know, we found out that we had soldiers in Niger only when they had been killed. I mean, you have senators getting on the TV saying, we got people in Niger. I mean, you know, so I mean, we have dozens of troops fighting in Niger. I bet some of you don't even know where that is. Or Niger, you know, I guess we used to call it back in the day, right? Huh? I imagine we got people fighting in places I don't know about right now. Mm-hmm.
I got to Vietnam in May of '64, and we didn't know about it.
Yes.
And we actually left Hawaii for Japan, and we just stayed out at sea for a couple months. And at night, there'd be flashes out there, and people would say, there's a war going on there. We said, no. And he said, yeah, we're bombing people.
64.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we said no. And then we stayed, well, we could never leave the area. We'd go to the Philippines, probably go to Hong Kong, but we could never go farther than that. And then in August '64, when the USS Maddox was attacked, and then we declared our open involvement in Vietnam. And then they gave us back 2 months back, or 4 months back combat pay. That, which is great when you're making $100 a month and somebody gives you $50 a month for fighting a war. They gave us $200 for fighting for 4 months, and we didn't know about it. No.
Yeah, that's early, so you had volunteered, you were not drafted.
No, I was volunteer.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's very early. And then
But I was
did
on a carrier, I was out in the sea, but
and did you ever land on Viet? Did you never step foot?
Could you repeat some of that for us over here?
we left Hawaii in May of '64, and the idea was to be in Japan on June 10th. We never got to Japan till Christmas, but they took us to Gulf of Tonkin, and at night we'd see flashes, and they would say that we're fighting a war over there, that we were bombing those people. And we said, no, our country doesn't do that.
Before the Gulf of Tonkin?
Before the Gulf of Tonkin, until August of '64, when the Gulf of Tonkin, and the USS Maddox was attacked by some PT boats. Well, they weren't attacked, allegedly attacked is what.
It's unclear.
That's unclear.
It's unclear.
It's unclear.
I think the first one.
Allegedly attacked.
Yeah.
So then we sent our planes over there and shot some, I don't know, but I don't think we destroyed any of them. But anyway, then they gave us 4 months back combat pay. So then we were actually told that we were there in August. So we were never told it before that. And when we got out in '65, still didn't know about the war. You know, not much.
And these are soldiers. I remember well, the guy that taught me Latin American history was like all of us, kind of just a true patriot, and he volunteered just after the Korean War ended, and he was sent to North Africa to defend U.S. nuclear installations in North Africa, and he said he was, in a very safe. He was guarding a nuclear installation in North Africa, and he was reading Stars and Stripes, and he opens it up, and there's a discussion of John Foster Dulles. And he says, we do not now, nor will we ever have, nuclear weapons in North Africa. He's reading this and starting to strike, sitting on top of a nuclear weapon. He said at that point was the first time in his life that he realized that, there's maybe things he doesn't know, that the government maybe not telling him everything. And he only, and we put that in the Stars and Stripes. So I just think it's a remarkable story. You were there really quite early, and
I didn't know it.
yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. I'm glad you made it back safe, and thank you.
Well,
Other comments or questions? All right, well, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to attending more of these. And if you have not seen the documentary, watch it. Thank you.